I am delighted again to welcome our second keynote speaker, Natalia Krapiva, who is a lawyer and senior tech legal counsel at AccessNow. And again, AccessNow is an institution, an organization, a community, I would say, that is beyond just being an official institution with borders. It's actually all around the world defending interests of civil society organizations, independent media activists, and Natalia will be talking about big tech and civil society, friends or foes. So, floor yours.
Slides for me. Okay, I should probably sit in a way that people see me. All right. Thank you so much, Ksenia, for the introduction and to the organizers for inviting me. It is a pleasure to meet so many new people from the academia world and beyond who are interested and passionate about and do interesting work in the field of technology and security, as well as some familiar faces like Ksenia, Ron, Marcus from Citizen Lab. In my speech today, I would like to switch gears a little bit and focus on a more practical or even pragmatic aspect of this topic, big tech, and talk about the relationship between the big tech and civil society, and especially around the issues of security. So I work for an international organization called AccessNow. Our mandate is to defend and extend the rights of people and communities at risk online. We run a digital security helpline, which is a 24/7 digital security help desk resource for civil society around the world. We organize conferences like RightsCon, engage in shaping digital rights policies, engage in strategic litigation, which I lead at the organization, and provide small grants to grassroots organizations. So my day-to-day work involves working with activists, journalists, human rights defenders, bloggers, and other civil society actors, and to find ways to better protect them and the work that they do, and the risks that they're facing, from the risks that they're facing online. As you can imagine, the vast majority of these risks that they're facing happen on platforms controlled by the big tech. Meta, Google or Alphabet, X or Twitter, Microsoft, and Amazon. The rights of our beneficiaries are fundamentally impacted by what these companies do or don't do. So what does this relationship look like? Are we friends or foes? In my mind, the answer to this question starts with it depends. Perhaps some of you may be surprised to hear this, but on some issues, civil society and big tech have come to see each other as allies. For example, both big tech and civil society have pushed back against attempts by governments to break or weaken encryption. At least since the time when the US government first tried to compel Apple and Google to provide backdoors to their encrypted services and devices, civil society and tech companies have been largely on the same side of this issue, defending the integrity of encryption that all of us, and especially civil society, rely on for the privacy and security of our data and communications. Over the years, AccessNow and our peer organizations like EFF, Amnesty, Citizen Lab, and others, we have spoke out and advocated against legislative and executive actions to attack end-to-end encryption in France, UK, Russia, United States, and other countries. We have intervened in legal cases on the side of big tech and other major platforms. For example, in case Telegram versus Russia at the European Court of Human Rights, or most recently, Nevada versus Meta at the Nevada District Court in the United States to defend encryption. And these battles are still ongoing. As end-to-end encryption becomes an essential part of the technologies that we rely on in our daily lives, by default, the governments around the world will continue trying to undermine it. And this means that there's more opportunities for the big tech and civil society to come together on this fight. Over the years, civil society have also come out on the side of the big tech platforms in cases where governments attempted to impose third-party liability for user-generated content or straight out shut down tech platforms for carrying speech that governments don't like. AccessNow and partners, both through our policy work on content governance, as well as the Keep It On Coalition, which is a global coalition that fights internet shutdowns. We have been urging states to stay away from blocking or imposing undue restrictions on big tech platforms. For example, we intervened in multiple legal cases, like at the ECOWAS court, challenging the Nigerian government's blocking of Twitter, and in the US, NetChoice versus Moody case, where we came out in defense of social media platforms against Florida and Texas state governments imposing stringent content regulation rules. Our EU team has worked hard on trying to shape Digital Services Act in the EU to make sure it does not become a tool for blocking platforms like Facebook or Twitter or imposing other disproportionate restrictions. Most recently, as Ron mentioned earlier in his keynote, big tech have also been our allies in protecting civil society against commercial spyware and other state-sponsored attacks and advanced threats occurring on their platforms. This unprecedented action that companies like Meta, Google, Apple, and Microsoft have taken on addressing spyware against civil society has been praised by AccessNow and other civil society partners. From sending out threat notifications to their users to implementing security measures, often specifically designed for civil society, like Google Advanced Protection Program or Apple Lockdown Mode, to filing lawsuits and amicus briefs against spyware vendors. These actions have made an enormous difference for the safety of civil society. And many were possible due to successful partnerships between big tech and organizations like AccessNow, Citizen Lab, Amnesty Tech, and others. On the legal front, AccessNow has led a coalition of human rights organizations where we intervened at the United States Ninth Circuit Court, and in the Supreme Court, we filed an amicus brief and a letter to the Solicitor General arguing in favor of WhatsApp's lawsuit against the infamous spyware vendor NSO Group. Now, civil society, big tech, and governments led by the US, UK, and France are joining forces together through processes like the Paris Peace Forum or the Pall Mall process. And we are coming together to tackle this problem of proliferation of commercial spyware that harms civil society. Also, in repressive countries where civil society and regular users do not trust the home-based platforms that are largely controlled by their governments, and where governments implement internet shutdowns, AccessNow's helpline, as well as our other partners from CiviCert, which is a coalition of civil society help desk like our helpline. We have been providing advice on privacy, security, and circumvention tools to enable safer access to some of the big tech platforms and other platforms, which we see as absolutely essential for people to be able to exercise their human rights online. But despite these positive engagements, we cannot glance over the fact that big tech has also not been doing enough to protect civil society, or sometimes even actively doing things that are harmful and hurting people's rights to privacy, freedom of expression, and other rights. Whether it's by collecting massive amounts of and selling massive amounts of data, which also we talked about and Ron mentioned, how that leads as well to surveillance, providing AI and other high-risk tools to governments with horrible human rights records, or by suppressing civil society voices and allowing bad actors to reshape public discourse, whether that's through broken algorithms, succumbing to government pressure, or over-complying with sanctions. Big tech in many ways are contributing to making the internet less free, safe, and secure for civil society and for all of us. For that reason, organizations like AccessNow have been at the forefront of criticizing companies and reminding them of their responsibility to respect human rights in all of their operations and decisions, inconsistent with the United Nations guiding principles on human rights. Big tech, like any other companies in any industry, big or small, they have the same obligations to know the impacts that they have on human rights, prevent or mitigate abuses, and then address harms that either they caused or may have contributed to. For example, we have been very vocal on big tech's succumbing to government pressure to censor civil society and high-risk communities. When Apple and Google, for example, infamously removed Alexei Navalny's smart voting app from their app stores under extreme pressure from the Russian government on the day of the 2021 elections, we have been very outspoken, and I personally wrote an op-ed criticizing the companies about the lack of transparency around the decisions and the lack of public pushback against this pressure. With recent conflicts and crises in Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, and other countries, we have been calling on platforms to stop silencing independent media and other critical voices online and develop better human rights respecting crisis response strategies, engage with the relevant stakeholders, and provide full transparency on their content moderation policies. We have been also critical of big tech's over-compliance with sanctions, which is something that I also work a lot on. For example, AccessNow, Article 19, Wikimedia Foundation, and other partners have been highlighting for years now how in repressive countries like Iran or Russia, the lack of access to certain services and technologies provided by big tech like Google services, despite explicit exemptions in Western sanctions for internet and human rights, these actions further isolate civil societies and people in those countries. We continue urging big tech to restore and expand services to communities in those countries that need them the most, and use and expand programs like donation through TechSoup and other means. And while big tech, as I mentioned, often and largely, I would say, oppose government action on breaking encryption, we have seen them also coming up with not so helpful solutions themselves that may still undermine privacy and security of our devices. Like Apple's 2021 attempt to scan user iCloud data for child abuse or CSAM images. AccessNow and other digital rights groups have very vocally and sharply criticized this move, which actually led to Apple coming out, pausing the feature, and actually admitting that it may introduce new threat vectors for bad actors to exploit, and as a result, they killed the feature. So how do we overcome these tensions? I would say that civil society's relationship with big tech is in many ways similar to how we work with some governments. Like with governments, we always have to be skeptical, of course, because the power balance is never in our favor. But I think on issues where our interests may align, we want to shape and reward the good behavior and join forces on some issues. But doing so requires understanding that big tech companies are not monoliths. Like governments that have various branches and agencies, companies also have different players and stakeholders, some of them who may be more sympathetic towards our causes. So, for example, threat and security teams maybe are allies on identifying digital security threats to civil society, while trust and safety or human rights policy teams can be helpful in addressing freedom of expression or other human rights concern on the platforms. Of course, many of these people that we actually talk to day to day, civil society, they often do not hold the ultimate power in the company. So also sometimes we have to work together with them to sort of persuade their leadership to act on human rights, which is almost always an uphill battle. But I think gradually big tech is realizing that paying attention to human rights and partnering with civil society on some issues can sometimes benefit them. So, for example, taking action on advanced threat actors that target civil society and protecting encryption helps big tech to increase the users' trust in the security of their products. Creating trust and safety and similar programs that allow civil society and other key stakeholders to advise them and to participate in governance, content governance decisions also helps big tech to ensure that their platforms are safer and that the proliferation of hate speech does not chase away their advertisers. And we know, unfortunately, we have seen platforms like Twitter or X under Elon Musk scrapping and completely disbanding these programs and trust and safety teams and regional teams that oftentimes we interact with as civil society, which led to extreme deterioration of public discourse on the platform and chased away the advertisers. And so we encourage big tech to invest and expand and deepen their partnership with civil society going forward. Now, of course, I can imagine that some of you may be skeptical and say, okay, why continue reinforcing this power imbalance and strengthen the disproportionate power that big tech has in our lives and on civil society? Why not invest in better, more ethical, more safer technologies that may be coming from the grassroots and other initiatives that may be more human rights respecting? In fact, we have seen many civil society driven or otherwise sort of smaller tech alternative platforms that emerge, and some are being used widely. For example, just a few years ago, I would say that Signal was much less known messaging platform, even in some civil society circles. And today it became a go-to secure communications app that is oftentimes preferred over WhatsApp or other platforms, and is used by regular users, journalists, activists, and even government officials, which, by the way, as much as they try to kill encryption, we all know that they all use Signal because they want to make sure that their communications are safe and secure from spies and other bad actors. So, and part of the continued success of Signal is that it's taking crucial steps to listen to civil society and implement important features. Like, for example, most recently, they heard about the need to remove phone numbers and allow for usernames, for people to be identified with usernames. So that made a huge difference to many high-risk people in civil society. So I absolutely believe that we should offer and make it easier for civil society to use other alternatives and not be as dependent on big tech platforms and technologies. And these tools need to be responsive to their actual needs and unique challenges that they're facing, whether they are located in France, United States, India, or Russia. But we also have to accept that big tech, at least for now, is not going anywhere, and for better or for worse. And there are still millions of vulnerable users that depend on these services and platforms. And so we have to continue, as civil society and other stakeholders, we have to continue investing in making these technologies better and safer for high-risk users. So to answer my question, are we friends or foes? I would say neither. And ultimately, each civil society organization or actor would decide for themselves which shape or form this relationship with the big tech takes. And it may depend on issue or time or a situation. But I think one thing is clear: both big tech and civil society will remain critical stakeholders in shaping the future of the internet and ensuring that it remains free, safe, and secure for all of us. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if you have.
Thanks a lot, Natalia. We have like around 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Again, very welcome.
Thanks very much. That is super interesting. And so, following what AccessNow did some great things. I wanted you to say, what I'm curious about is how your argument that it's not good or bad, and so you sort of decide it itself. How has the kind of work with platforms changed AccessNow? That is, if we assume that power is not just between the big tech and state, but that civil society organizations are enmeshed in the way that platform power is operationalized, how has it changed the way that AccessNow does it? Whether you can say a little bit more about it. And is that a theme that is the organization itself reflexive about those it's not just on specific projects, but over time, how does the work priorities of the organization change because of our cooperation, collaboration?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think it's a constant thought process and decision making. I would say that I don't think we have a loss because of, and obviously with the helpline, which is I think the most important, like sort of most high risk work that we do, and it happens to realize, I said, because most cases actually are related to social media, or a large chunk of cases related to platforms. And so definitely we're consciously always trying to make sure that we don't compromise our ability to call them out and question. And I think, I mean, in my mind, I see that we have achieved that understanding, I think, at this point, especially with the big players who know us well, that we reserve our right? We may go to them sometimes and say, okay, can you explain us what is happening? Is there an explanation? Is there an algorithm? You know, if something is, there's a censorship or other issue. And sometimes it is possible to address that, but we always have that leverage as well. And I'm sure, I mean, they don't like it. They often get their sort of feathers rattled, like when we have that power on top and say, you know what, there's always advocacy, there's always media and public opinion, and this might be embarrassing for you, and we are not afraid to exercise that option. And so, but somehow still, I think we managed to have that balance. So we always try, you know, we hold ourselves obviously accountable, because we never would say, you know what, we can't criticize this company because they help us on spyware or something like this. And I think, but that's an important thing, that a question, and that every organization or other stakeholders, that work with governments, work with companies, have to always make sure they know the answer to the question, and they know what they're doing, and they're held accountable.
One question. Yeah, the college we did along is very nice. I love it, very interesting. So you're very clear on the implications within the content and the working. Of course, AccessNow probably also is really vital in many issues. So we mentioned Ukraine, directly imagine that there will be very good reasons to speak in terms of where what we want to do with that. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the work of AccessNow in Europe, how we handle this contributing to the ways in which one could take the conditions and very different than the other transport.
Thank you. Do you mean in terms of like resources dedicated, or like politically?
Yeah. Because so there very good reasons for working with some civil society organizations, so I would also imagine that there would be very good reasons for work with government and then standing these conditions. So I wonder how you deal with
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Yes, the day-to-day realities that we face. I think we manage again. I mean, I love AccessNow. I think it's a great organization. I've been with them for 5 years, so I think it's something what I love about the organization, that we managed to like have very conscious discussions and about this issue. So it was quite obvious here with Ukraine, how the companies responded, how the world responded. And then with Gaza, oftentimes like there was not so much of that response. And yes, in that way, you could compare perhaps our Eastern policy team, which I actually founded and formed at AccessNow, versus our MENA team. They may have sometimes different, like MENA team is very critical, very outspoken about what's happening to the suppression of Palestinian voices, for example, on Meta and other platforms. While like the Eastern Europe team, we would always be, okay, well, Meta is doing a lot also to like secure Ukrainian civil society and people. So it's something that I don't think clashes, but it definitely, it really forced some introspection, thinking, okay, are we actually going to just, make Ukraine a special, or we're going to try to dedicate the same amount of resources and attention to this crisis as well, and also call for others and companies as well to put in the resources. And so we actually published a guidance called Content Governance in Times of Crisis, where we actually have recommendations for platforms to be more consistent in approaching to crisis and conflicts in terms of content moderation, in terms of the security measures that they roll out, and cooperation with stakeholders and so on. So yes, I mean, it is a potential conflict, and like everybody, all our organizations and actors, we are forced to reckon with it, but I think we have so far dealt with it well, I think.
It's a matter that's amazing that I've been following what AccessNow for the last 5 years. I had a question about the feedback I was in the legal science side, if you can say. And I think besides that one answer, yes, we have been talking about this company in Europe and other colleagues from Russia as being the least transparent, though one of the most influential companies that serve populations in Russia, in Iran, Brazil, and yes, something about Telegram. They have been not like unreadable ways for us and the rest of the AccessNow also tries to reach out to them. And at the same time, they have become like the resource, public resource, for civil society, people put a lot of trust in this app, regardless of its security laws, but by many years, so there is this part of the trust on one level, and on the other, absolutely transparency. So they will tell a little bit more about any progress that's happening in Telegram, communication with them, and their approaching the policies here in AccessNow.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned Telegram, but as I was working on the speech, I kept thinking, okay, does it belong in big tech or not? I guess technically no, but we kind of consider it as plus, like big tech plus maybe. Yeah, I think Telegram highlights actually what I was talking about. It matters when we interact with big tech, when we try to shape and influence their behavior, we see very direct consequences and fruits. So for example, companies like Twitter, before it became X under Musk, the structures that it developed, trust and safety teams, regional teams that interacted with civil society, with various stakeholders, they were really one of the best companies. I mean, as far as you could say, okay, the standard is very low, but still amongst the big tech, they were the most advanced in terms of being responsive and honest and listening to criticism and taking it on board. That was before Musk. Now it's all completely gone. But Telegram didn't have it, and still they don't have it. They don't have a human rights team. They don't have a trust and safety team. They don't have regional teams who speak the languages of at least the major, countries where they have big presence. It is a constant source of struggle. We have criticized. We have privately, openly. We have tried again and again, sent letters and other requests to actually form some sort of channel, because people come to us, even UN comes to us and says, do you have a contact with Telegram? And we say, if the UN does, if they don't care, they don't listen, they don't respond to the UN, for us, it's even harder, let alone some smaller grassroots organizations in Myanmar or Brazil or somewhere where people are literally being doxxed and their addresses and coordinates are being posted on Telegram, and then they're being murdered and their photos are posted on the channels. So, and Durov is ignoring it. I mean, Durov is basically, it is his own personal views of freedom of expression. I mean, you can say it's similar to Musk. But he says, okay, this is basically the content governance policy for Telegram, is Durov's personal views about freedom of expression. And so, yes, we remain, I mean, our door is still open. We welcome a channel, but definitely it is something that is an example of the difference it could make, where companies at least listen and try, even after a lot of pressure, they respond and have those channels, versus like Telegram, it's a complete ignore, I would say.
Thank you very much. So for several researchers or developers who work with scrutinizing the backends of the platforms, something particularly goes where this morning for a few days. One of the things that has been a major obstacle in some working experience is the closing down of API. For example, the first for the platforms of population. So speaking of access, access now, do you think that there is a line for activism there for the country to ensure that the back end of the problem?
Yeah, it's a hard issue. I also worked on this a little bit before I came to AccessNow. And before I was also briefly working in law enforcement. I work on open source investigations for human rights and accountability. And that was something that open source researchers like Valentine and others relied on a lot, at API access. And I remember my first RightsCon, I just started at AccessNow, and they closed, the Meta closed that access, and I was talking to their folks at, I think, in the human rights team, and it was explained to us that it is something that it was in response to Cambridge Analytica and sort of, yeah, bad actors exploiting it. And then most recently also Musk closed it as well for Twitter. And those researchers who we know, who also research disinformation and trolls, fake accounts on Twitter, that really tremendously hurt their work. We haven't really, because there's so much to do, and even though we're a larger organization now, over like 100 people, but still there's so many digital rights and access issues. We haven't really taken it on board so much, like part of our portfolio, but definitely we hear that from the communities that we work with and researchers, and it's something that I think is worth highlighting, that it's kind of been forgotten, but I know that it's a continuous struggle, and there is argument to be made that it should be allowed for legitimate, perhaps for a very small, again, like well-established groups or universities, right, to allow that access. Definitely, I think that's something that should be taken on by more organizations.
Very interesting questions that are raised by current panelists, in particular, dealing with platforms that are considered not as tools, but as agents for repression or distraction. I think those questions are particularly timely, not only because we are in the time of war, but also we are also in the time of electoral processing, both in Europe and many parts of Europe. So that's very essential for the individual question. But to insert this particular thread, we have not 5 panelists, but 5 papers. And we would start today with a group, 2 panelists, Siena, Anstis, and Michaelsen, who are coming from Munk School at the University of Toronto. And Siena is a senior legal advisor to the Citizen Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, right? And your scholarly work has been published in a range of publications, including the Backfield Law Journal, the Canadian Bar Review, and the Oxford Journal of Human Rights Practices. Marcus Michaelsen, working as a senior researcher for this lab, the Citizen Lab, in a project on gender-related digital transnational projection, correct? And Benoît published both the co-author both on research, ethics, and risk in the authoritarian field, right? And your research has done global practices of digital technology and resilience, with a particular emphasis on social media platforms and the risk they pose to human rights defenders. Our second panelist this afternoon will be dealing with the big tech and Russian wartime censorship, right? Comparing platform conflicts, dynamics of Russian platform bans. Mariëlle Wijermars, you're coming from the University of Maastricht. You're an assistant professor in international governance, and your researcher are focusing on international freedom and the human rights implication of international policy and platform governance, particularly authoritarian states. And you also authored in 2018 memory policies in contemporary Russian, television, Siena, and the States. Right? Then the third panelists working on social media censorship and repression in Palestine and Israel. Natalia, you're coming from the Berlin Center at Harvard University. Natalia, you're a researcher at the Berlin Science Center, as I said, and research focusing on social media, online system censorship, and human rights issues with the disputes on Palestine and Israel. And then, to deal with security from a distance, the role we take in the fight against violent extremism in Iran. We have Anne Bellon, you're from the University of Technology of Compiègne, where you are your assistant professor, maître de conférence in French. You're focusing on security and technology issues. Your work is examining the role of major technology companies in countering violent extremism, particularly in the university context. And you authored the word in French. May I quote in French? Les politiques de l'Internet à la place de l'accès de production for the French speakers and readers. And last but not least, Valentine will say you're going to deal with dictate, algorithmic content moderation, and wartime. Valentine, you've co-authored this paper. I think we rather to co-author to be the co-author of paper with Benoît, who's working at the University of Genève, and you're coming from the University of Genève, right? You're a researcher at the University of Genève, and Benoît is a professor in criminology at the University of Montreal. And your cooperation focuses on the intersection between technology, security, and human rights. And your research is focusing on the implication of algorithmic content moderation policies of major technology companies in the context of counter-terrorism force. You have also covered a certain number of articles, such as with Valentine and yes, your Valentine et Benoît, sorry. Internet et propagande djihadiste, la régulation polyscientifique du cyberespace dans la revue Critique internationale. So we have excellent panelists, and I think we obviously start with Marcus dealing with big tech platforms, digital transnational repression, and globalized security risk of human rights defenders. The role in individuals, and then Marguerite will take the lead for the Q&A session and debate. Because unfortunately, I could say all of the people that part of the panel, but I will follow that up on YouTube later. Have a good time.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you also for organizing this great conference. So my colleague Siena actually could not make it to Paris, with whom I co-authored this paper, but I will present our joint work here. And it is based on our research on digital transnational repression at the Citizen Lab. Digital transnational repression means when governments, mostly authoritarian governments, reach across borders to silence, control, and repress dissidents in diaspora and exile communities. Okay, no, this is not. Yes. Okay. Good. So just to give you a short, quick overview, 2 years ago, my colleagues published the first report on digital transnational repression in Canada, where they interviewed targets of different origin to work out the psychosocial and emotional impacts of these tactics. And at the moment, we are in an ongoing project on gender-based digital transnational repression that studies threats against women activists and dissidents. And we are working on a larger scope of interviews. Almost 90 interviews with people of different origin countries and residing in across Europe, North America, and other countries. And this presentation is now work in progress based on these insights that we gained from these interviews. So contrary to other teams at the Citizen Lab, we don't do technical work. We go through interviews like social science research methods, qualitative interviews to work out the methods and impacts of digital transnational repression. So let me just start with an example to give you an idea. So about 2 years ago, in May 2022, the Instagram accounts of a group of Iranian feminists received suddenly overnight thousands of new followers. And this sudden increase overwhelmed the accounts and reduced their visibility on the platform. Most of these women were based abroad, and they counted among the more influential voices of the Iranian women's rights movement. And an investigation later found that a Pakistani company was actually behind this artificial increase of new followers. And this company sold followers, likes, and shares for marketing purposes. And in this case, these shady services were used for a coordinated harassment campaign against these activists, aiming to silence them. And the resources that were necessary to hire such services and the profile of the targets made it quite likely that the Iranian state was the actual perpetrator behind these attacks. So this is an example of what we call digital transnational repression, the use of digital tools to monitor, silence, or control dissidents across borders. Authoritarian states increasingly resort to these digital threats. Digital technologies have given them new tools to new capacities and tools to control and silence dissent across borders. And these threats can have severe impacts on the targeted individuals. Many of our interviewees said that they experienced fear, stress, and burnout. Their mental health and well-being were affected. They reduced contacts with families and friends. They cut relations with other diaspora members. And they also engaged in self-censorship and withdrew from activism. And in these dynamics of digital transnational repression, big social media platforms as Instagram and X, or formerly Twitter, play, of course, an important role, because many of these activists still continue to rely on these platforms to draw attention to their work and to connect with others. And as a result, these platforms become the primary sites for threats and attacks like defamation campaigns, harassment, and information manipulation. And digital transnational repression clearly affects the safety and fundamental rights of the targeted individuals. And this means that platforms are in a key position to protect the security of these targeted activists. So in this presentation, we were asking, so how are platforms dealing with and responding to digital transnational repression? How are they enabling or preventing threats? So like, most participants in this workshop and also in line with the growing literature, we do not consider platforms as neutral intermediaries or simple transmitters of content. And we think that in the dynamics of contentious politics and security, platforms clearly have agency, as also argued by our colleague Mariëlle here on our panel in one of her publications. There's literature that discusses the role and influence of platforms in security dynamics of election manipulation or armed conflict, like in Myanmar or Ethiopia. But so far, there has been no attention to the platform's role in these dynamics of digital transnational repression. So when governments extraterritorialize their political controls and coercion. And we think that there are different mechanisms of platform governance that shape these practices of digital transnational repression. So the ways platforms control and regulate the social and political life that they enable with their services play a role in how they enable or prevent digital transnational repression. And I will now go through these dynamics here, these mechanisms here, and based on the insights from our interviews, provide some examples of how these mechanisms influence practices of digital transnational repression. So in terms of the technical affordances, perpetrators are able to exploit and manipulate some of these, what is built into the design of the platform. So for instance, like we've heard also this morning from Ron, the algorithmic sorting of content that privileges posts with high user engagement and emotional content actually facilitates a more viral distribution of harassment and threats. So several of our interviews told us that state-affiliated users with high outreach mobilized their followers to attack them. Human rights defenders from Eritrea, for instance, faced massive harassment and abuse after Eritrean ambassadors incited regime loyalists in the diaspora to attack them. Then, of course, inauthentic accounts and paid trolls that run multiple fake profiles are also used to amplify hate speech and defamation, as we have seen in the example of Iran that I mentioned in the beginning. And finally, also the perpetrators use the feature of reporting accounts for the violation of community guidelines to silence dissidents. So they will mobilize regime supporters or use fake accounts to mass report critics. And these accounts are then blocked or they receive a warning, and activists actually risk losing their own small platform to speak out and their network of contacts. Then second point, I switched the order here. The content moderation also poses problems for targets. So several interviews told us that when they posted about the harassment that they experienced and they shared screenshots of some of the threats that they were receiving, then their own posts were blocked because they violated community guidelines, while the original post remained accessible. And they couldn't explain it. They suspected that accounts with a large number of followers were under more intense scrutiny from these automated content moderation systems. So these mechanisms remain opaque for activists, and especially when they post in languages other than English. And to reduce this risk of automated blocking or mass reporting, many told us that they started self-censoring their posts and somehow avoiding certain topics and terms. The community guidelines of the platforms capture some of the practices of digital transnational repression, like bullying, harassment, inciting violence, hate speech. But these practices, policies come along with a broadly acknowledged failure to effectively enforce them. And so, yeah, teams on content moderation lack native or fluent speakers, so that non-harmful content is removed, and harmful content that uses coded language stays on the platform. Then it's also important how platforms deal with government requests to remove content, or how they protect the data of their users against government requests to access them. And over-compliance with such requests and without proper consideration for the practice of DTR, or for the motive of digital transnational repression, can of course lead to harm for the activists. Platforms are also inconsistent in dealing with government requests for content removal. So there are cases in Turkey and India where platforms have abided by requests for content removal, or they left clearly abusive content from government actors on the platform because they didn't want to jeopardize their access to these profitable markets. And another example for how this relation between platforms and governments might put dissidents at risk is Saudi Arabia, where the government has managed to recruit employees at Twitter to access the personal information of Saudi users who were critical of the government. The next point is security and risk management. So these platform, Meta, for instance, conducts research into the surveillance industry or campaigns of information manipulation. And they also provide some educational material for at-risk users. But most of these proposed solutions put the responsibility on the individual user. So they are told to block content or report aggressive accounts, report threats to law enforcement, but there are no systematic solutions from the side of the platform to detect and deal with digital transnational repression. And as we've heard from Natalia, the teams for human rights and security at X have been dismantled so that these relations between civil society and the platforms were cut. And finally, the last important point are accountability mechanisms. So in order to respond to insults and harassment, many of our interviewees told us that they were using these available mechanisms to block and report users. And some of them consistently engaged in this practice, but it takes a lot of time and energy, and some also were skeptical about the use of reporting perpetrator accounts because of the sheer amount of threats that they were receiving on a daily basis. And also, when they have to report the threats that they experience, they have to go, again, they have to document through this potentially traumatizing material. And several people also complained about the difficulties to reinstate profiles that were closed as a result of mass reporting from regime affiliates, because these platforms, yeah, as we have heard, remain unresponsive. Targets need context inside the organization. And even when they have this privileged access, it takes a long time to get an answer and to get their profile back. So some interviews said they compared these platforms to a corrupt system where you need privileged access or a contact to get a response to your needs. So yeah, just to conclude, I wanted to show that how these different mechanisms of platform governance shape the risks and the harm experienced by targets of digital transnational repression. So we saw that the technical affordances and the design can be exploited for attacks, that the community guidelines and their implementation, the regulation of the platform fail to capture and control practices of digital transnational repression and mitigate the risks for activists. And which is also very important, that the platforms remain intransparent and unaccountable to targets of cross-border repression who seek support and redress. Thank you very much.
Mariëlle, let me deal with well, oh yes, you have to switch.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So Mariëlle had to really move on with another part of her censorship, particularly with that with debate, but Marcus maybe to reflect online just for us that we Canada where we are children the next we have your very much to do with the Chinese diaspora and saying that now we're moving to another state actor in the use of censorship in wartime, as we mentioned during the introduction. So, Mariëlle, the floor is yours.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm very much looking forward also to continue our conversation this afternoon and tomorrow as well. I think it's really an excellent community that the organizers have been able to gather here. So indeed, I will be picking up actually on some of the threads that Marcus was talking about, but also some of the threads from the earlier panels. Because what I try to understand is indeed what the agency is of platforms and the interactions between states and platforms and users in bringing about censorship. And also in reverse, for example, the role of platforms in facilitating state propaganda. And I do mostly research on Russia, so that's also what I've been talking about today. But I think that these questions are actually much broader. So of course, not only applying to Russia itself. So for quite some years, I've been following these clashes. So clashes between the Russian state on the one hand and all these platform companies on the other hand. And there's both domestic companies, if we want to call them domestic, like Yandex, or even more domestic, VK, and then all these international platform companies. And these clashes have been very, very active. So we've seen strings of court cases and threats and political scandals, and they continue. So just recently, Russia sentenced the Meta spokesman, what is it, 6 years in jail for terrorism. And this is related to a comment about their content moderation policies regarding Ukraine in Ukraine. The interesting thing is that also Meta as a company is designated as an extremist organization, so they're outlawed. At the same time, WhatsApp is not blocked, but I will return to that. So some confusion here. If we look to the right, then we see clashes with Google also continuing. We've seen every few months a new court case and a new fine being imposed on Google. And by now, these fines are also very, very substantial. At the same time, the Google affiliate in Russia has actually filed for bankruptcy because Russia seized their assets. So I'm not really sure if they can pay these fines. These are just two examples of what these kinds of clashes consist of. But of course, the substance underneath it is actual repression and censorship, and repression and the curtailment of freedom of expression. So I'm very interested in these relationships, but of course, the most extreme form of that is when platforms are actually banned. So there's a lot of these clashes and interactions between states and platforms before that, when states try to impose more and more pressure to get companies to comply and basically can become complicit in their repression of human rights. But at the end point, there are also blocks. So we see increasingly internet shutdowns, social media bans, and so on. But within this field, there is now more and more research emerging, but it's quite difficult to actually research because these cases tend to be quite fragmented. So it's either only one social media platform gets blocked or only temporarily and so on. But in the case of Russia, we now have a very interesting case, so to say. So of course, it's very tragic, but at the same time also for us interesting to try and understand those relationships better, because we actually have a very contradictory case where Russia has blocked several social media platforms, which you can say are foreign and Western, but at the same time, not all of them, even though you would expect that actually they would have blocked more. So theoretically, this allows us to then try and explore why is that? So what is it about these platforms that they have blocked some, but not others, even though they might be actually violating, for example, the same laws. So after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia went ahead and actually blocked Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. At the same time, they did not block and still have not blocked YouTube, WhatsApp, and Telegram. So as I just mentioned, this is particularly interesting also in the case of WhatsApp, because the actual mother company has been designated an extremist organization and the spokesperson was just jailed in absentia. But that's, of course, just to give you an introduction of how paradoxical all Russian internet policy is. It doesn't make sense. But for us, like analytically, it's interesting because all of these platforms, you can say that they're foreign, and they're foreign in the type that we would classify as Western. Telegram is its own case. We can discuss that separately, perhaps. As types of platforms, they fall largely under the same kind of legislation. So it's not that that is the key differentiating factor here. And at the same time, they're also accused of doing the same stuff. So the kind of accusation and the degree of accusation is also quite similar. So why have some been blocked and why not? Why others have not? So if we zoom out a little bit, then the way that I'm approaching this, and I should warn you, this will become a little bit theoretical, what I want to contribute here today. If we zoom out, what I think this really points towards is that we should be looking at the states not in isolation as we often do. So we look, for example, at the Russian market just as Russia by itself, and then it ends at the borders. But of course, in reality, that's not the case. These infrastructures actually extend. And especially when we look at the composition of these infrastructures, they consist of all kinds of components with different origins and different power relations. So in the case of Russia, this means that these are Chinese components, it means they're US actors and so on. And all of these are also integrated and interdependent. So to implement censorship, an authoritarian state actually has to pressure a lot of actors or try to gain leverage over all kinds of actors. And the case of Russia shows that that is incredibly difficult to do. Never mind their discourse about digital sovereignty. So if we take this as a starting point, then actually the way that we should approach the role of technological companies and the position of autocracies to be able to censor, everything looks quite different. So we actually have to take into consideration, what do all these different power relationships look like, and why do they have leverage or not? And by doing that, we also can understand the agency of the platforms better. So how do these dependencies influence the capacities of authoritarian states to repress? So one component here, what we often see, for example, in political science literature, that is now also more interested in internet censorship, is that social media as a variable is very convenient. So you just have social media. Of course, as we already had some discussions earlier this morning, some social media companies, they have their own internet cables. Others are like leasing servers, and that's already quite the difference. Another thing we see often is this very black and white opposition between what is domestic and what is foreign. Oftentimes, this is also not really true. So, for example, Yandex, often seen as a Russian company, but at the same time, until very, very recently, this was a Dutch-registered company. So how domestic is this really? So we need to have a better differentiation of all of these different aspects to really try and understand what are these social media companies and what are their relations to these states, to be able to really describe all these different cases in a way that actually makes sense. So the way that I approach this is trying to understand, or to create a theoretical framework almost, for how to really capture those different dimensions. So how can we describe what these social media companies are in that particular case, in a way that allows us to understand better why states would choose to limit them or not, what the agency of platforms is, and also what the actual impacts of those measures are or could be. So the ones that I've highlighted in yellow are the ones that we often see in analysis. So if we want to explain why did Russia first block LinkedIn and so on, then what you often hear is they started with the smallest platform. So why would they not block YouTube? Because it's too popular, there's too many people on YouTube. At the same time, they have now blocked Instagram, and Instagram was incredibly popular. It was so popular that they gave a 2-day ahead notice and allowed everyone to sort of transfer to other platforms, and they even gave you instructions for how to do it. They were perfectly fine with doing that, so apparently audience size is not enough. Another one we often see is the political use. So if a platform is used for protest organization, then they might get blocked more easily. At the same time, we see some counterintuitive cases here. So for example, YouTube is one of the main platforms for getting or exile journalism into Russia. Still, it is not blocked. Why is that? Another thing is political use by the state. This one might have a little bit more leverage because Russia indeed uses these platforms for their own propaganda as well. They might use this to gain insight into what citizens think. But at the same time, one of the things that has frustrated them most is that YouTube is actually censoring Russian media. But YouTube's still not blocked, so also not really working. Then another one we often see is distinctiveness. So why has YouTube not been blocked? Because YouTube is quite particular. There is no Russian YouTube. I will not go into detail, but well, there kind of is. So also doesn't really work. But of course, this is just to give you a few highlights, but actually we need to go even deeper to see really why is it so different, but especially also that Russia might want to do something, but actually cannot, which is something we often do not touch upon, because they actually are dependent in various ways. So I want to add a few things. So what is the actual societal use? So for example, embedding in societal daily practices. Also the affordances, so what does a platform in its design allow you to do and not do, which might play a role. Advertisement monetization, so actual network effects, how do people make money, how do you draw people onto your platform and so on, and also infrastructural interdependence. So in the example that I will give you in a moment, I will highlight these two. So first, indeed, the economic part, which I think we often miss, especially when we talk about censorship and authoritarian repression. So how do you actually make a platform work? That's incredibly difficult. It's difficult to move people from one platform to the other. It's almost impossible to do. And indeed, these infrastructural interdependencies. So they might not want to limit something if it can generate this like domino effect within your infrastructure. That's a risky thing to do. They might also not be able to actually do that. So that's also another component there. So if you do that for all of them, then you get this little overview, which is still very much work in progress. But as you can see, like this is quite complicated, but just to not necessarily arrive at a causal relationship, because we are dealing with two black boxes. So we do not have access to the decision-making on the state level and also not so much on the platform level, but we can describe what the differences is of these different cases and then what might be suitable explanations. So based on this, if I again take the example of YouTube, by doing it like this, I get other possible scenarios. So that is not just about their technical capacity to do so because they can. It's not just about the political will to do so because the political will is there, but it might be something else. And actually, I wanted to discuss just one of them, which I think is the one that is like least discussed. And that is how do you get people on a platform and how do you make it make money? Because in authoritarian states, platforms still need to make money because they're expensive. Even if the state wants to bankroll them, they need to have some form of income. You need to have influencers producing content for you, and they need to do it on a regular basis. So you have to pay them. So this makes everything very complicated. So as I mentioned, there are Russian alternatives to YouTube. Some of them come from some of the like established companies, but the one that they've been trying to push for a very long time and quite unsuccessfully is RuTube, so the Russian YouTube. And especially in the last 2 years, they've been really pushing a lot of money into this, really trying to invest, and also forcing, for example, the Russian movie producers and so on to shift all the products from YouTube to their platform so that there's more content on there. But there was a very interesting thing in the early days. So when they were trying to attract users to RuTube, was that YouTube stopped monetization. So there's no advertisement on YouTube in Russia, and you also cannot make money from ads in Russia. So this created a very strange situation. So I will quote here Alexander Moiseev, who was the general director of YouTube at the time. So he said, those who watch YouTube suddenly got premium accounts because there's no monetization for creators. There's also no ads for viewers. The competition has become more difficult. We want to show advertisements so that bloggers can earn money, but on YouTube, there's no advertisement. Of course, YouTube is convenient for the viewer at the moment. So they had this policy issue that they were having to get more content. So there was not enough content on their platform. They have to promote that people make content. So they have to pay the bloggers. And to pay the bloggers, they wanted to do advertisement. But then YouTube has more content, it's more interesting, and it has no ads. So guess where the users were? They were all on YouTube, right? So this is another kind of explanation that comes directly from the way that platforms work, that actually also matters for authoritarian states and also matters for how they engage in both censorship and in propaganda. So what I aim to drive home, like through creating this alternative theoretical framework, is that indeed social media are very different, and we should take all of these differences into account to be able to better describe these cases and to be able to better describe both these dependencies as well as decision-making processes. They are dissimilar in ways that are extremely relevant. For example, the fact that YouTube is connected to Google, yes, that's incredibly important. So Android is still the dominant mobile operating system in Russia. It continues to be so. It's incredibly important. One thing that also is often disregarded when you more quantitative studies is all of this is quite relational. So you get time stamps, a moment in time, but 3 months onwards, it might be that one platform is actually used by a different community. It might be more important, less important, and so on. So these things are very relational. So what is the impact of a platform when it's blocked? It might be very small, but it might also be very large. And it depends on the moment in time, as well as the other platforms and other services that are available in that market. So everything is relational. And that's, of course, difficult to take on board if you want to come to causal studies or like quantitative. But I think it's incredibly important for understanding what actually is going on. And then finally, a bit in line with what I just said, is that this is inherently dynamic, which is difficult for us to capture in analysis, but that's just the reality of these platform landscapes. So the products are changing. Telegram is launching new things all the time. The product is changing. The policies are changing as well. Some of the policies on the back end might be changing that we don't know of. The markets are changing and the user practices are changing as well. So to really understand what is going on, to really understand decision-making processes, and to really understand the impact of all of these decisions, we have to take on board all of these differences. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariëlle, for this fascinating presentation. Really more about the role of Telegram and the usage of Telegram by restaurant in particular, and targeting which audiences which we have. It's very, very interesting. Super interesting would be also perhaps a link that we could make between Telegram and UTC. It's part of your partners at some point. So it would be super interesting to listen to. But we're moving from what censorship, perhaps from the state actor that we wanted to mention more fully about statute and other conflict between non-state and state actors using censorship. In a particular specific context, and we're very eager to listen to your presentation now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, I wanted to thank you for this opportunity to speak, and just to say that I'm very impressed with the conference already and hearing all the similarities in the research that all of our presenters have been doing, which I think just reinforces how important it is that we continue having these conversations and doing this work. My name is Natalia. I'm a fellow with the Institute for Rebooting Social Media at the Berkman Klein Center. I also previously worked in big tech. I was at Meta for a few years as a software engineer working on various privacy and security teams. So the perspective and presentation I'd like to share with you all today attempts to bridge academic and research discussions on online speech and online harms with the way technologies implicitly or covertly contribute to this perception of censorship and repressed content. And despite using censorship and repression in the title, I'll be explaining how these terms are nuanced and the way technology reinforces these constructs. So as we all know, social media platforms are prevalent in our daily lives and are especially vital during times of political unrest, The global reach, utility, and ease of use in both consuming and producing content has made these platforms crucial in giving individual users the power to share real-world events. And in the Middle East in particular, social media has been a liberating tool for people during the Arab Springs and has enabled large social movements by offering a platform for users to mass mobilize, share news, and challenge oppressive regimes. In Palestine specifically, activists and independent journalists rely on these platforms to bring awareness to crisis situations as they're developing. In 2021, a group of families in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem were being evicted from their homes, and this incident garnered international attention. And social media became a window into the escalations that were happening on the ground. Given frequently biased and unequal mainstream media coverage, social media became an essential and central player in the region. However, the reliance on these platforms doesn't come without critique in the way that they fail to uphold commitments such as giving users a right to speak, share information, and organize. And many factors contribute to claims and instances of voices being suppressed on these platforms, particularly in response to the sharing of sensitive or potentially graphic content. Platforms typically ramp up their risk management processes during times of crisis by adjusting automated content moderation systems to action on potentially violating content. These decisions, as well as the unintended consequences of existing products and features that are used within these contexts, all contribute to instances of censorship and cases of perceived censorship on these platforms. So in 2021, following the Sheikh Jarrah escalation, the BSR commissioned a human rights due diligence report to investigate the adverse effect that Meta's platforms had in enabling violence in the region. They recommended that Meta reevaluate certain content moderation policies and take substantial action to increase transparency around their practices and policies. And I was working at Meta in 2021 and was involved in various work streams to escalate mistakes, such as the banning of the Al-Aqsa hashtag, the over-enforcement and account takedowns of prominent activists and journalists, and observe the overall feeling of repression on these platforms from people in our communities. Even observing on personal accounts, content shared that was related to Palestine would have limited reach. Just this past year in 2023, Human Rights Watch compiled thousands of reports of repressed content related to Palestine on Instagram and Facebook. They claim that Meta's censorship of Palestinian voices is systemic and global. Over the last few years, Hamna, a digital rights group in Palestine, has collected millions of reports of content takedowns and instances of hate speech targeting Palestinians. A letter published by Hamna in October 2023 and signed by dozens of civil society groups, including AccessNow, urged tech companies to adhere to human rights principles and safeguard freedom of expression on these platforms. So these letters and public statements from civil society groups typically center the downstream impact platforms have had on people. And a lot of existing literature and research in this space primarily highlights the inconsistent application and bias that creeps into product and crisis policies. An example of one of Meta's policies that contributed to censorship is the handling of the term shaheed, which is a term that means martyr in Arabic, but is subject to over-enforcement and accounts for more content removals than any other term on the platform. And so alongside these policy discussions, there's also powerful technological repercussions that perpetuate inequalities as well. And today I'd like to focus instead on the way technology and features are actors in this debate and are accountable in suppressing speech. So the development of features and the way that they function have an impact that are just as profound, larger in scale, and harder to detect than many policy flaws. The product teams in big tech companies are tasked with developing systems to drive business incentives, which are usually aligned with growth and engagement, as Ron had noted in his keynote earlier. Many of these social media platforms have evolved from simply being photo or idea sharing apps and are instead used within activism contexts, where the stakes are higher and particularly divisive or at-risk regions, and where certain decisions could mean either life or death. I'll share two examples. In May 2021, Instagram launched an experiment to favor original content over reshared content on Instagram stories. This change received significant blowback from users that primarily use the app to raise awareness and to share resources through reshared posts. And at the time of the Sheikh Jarrah escalation, it severely impacted the reach of posts about Palestine. And while I was working at Meta at the time, we heard a lot of concerns from users that were feeling like they were shadow banned because of this experiment. Shadow banning is a term that's used to describe when post visibility is severely reduced. And so when this experiment was launched, we felt like we were explaining why this was happening. And that prompts a very powerful question, which is what responsibility do platforms have in reconciling users' expectations and the way they want to use these platforms with the platform's original intentions? So the second example actually happened this past November 2023, and it was a mistake in Meta's AI translation system on Instagram. It was translating Palestinian with Arabic text in an Instagram user's bio to Palestinian terrorists. And the system, the AI system, was trained on posts and comments in language that was shared on the platform. And given the influx in hateful comments at the time, this was fed into the system and created AI hallucinations, which amplified this dangerous and harmful trope. Now, to mitigate harmful side effects of these systems and technologies, in recent years, integrity and trust and safety have been central to a lot of these discussions in how we can minimize platform harms. The definition of trust and safety is a set of practices, principles, and tools that promote safety, security, and define acceptable behavior for users on online platforms. Every product and feature team has guardrails in place to protect users, limit unwanted interactions, and minimize harm. However, these functions, just as the features and products they're designed to protect, can potentially have negative impacts and can be manipulated, misunderstood, or have adverse human rights impacts in the region. So, just as another presenter mentioned earlier, mass reporting tactics are employed to remove content, thereby manipulating the feature that was intended to limit content that violates community standards. And another example is the Israeli cyber unit submits thousands of content removal requests that's led to the suppression of legitimate Palestinian speech. X, formerly known as Twitter, also launched a community notes feature to attempt to curb misinformation. However, the reliability of deploying a community-based approach versus professional fact checkers hasn't proven to be any more effective and leaves room for individual bias to creep into decision-making. And one additional integrity feature that has contributed to this perception of censorship is the launch of content controls on Instagram and Facebook. The purpose of the feature is to give more agency to users to control their experiences on the platform and to curate whether they want to limit or see more graphic or political content. However, when the feature was released, there was a lot of controversy because it was set to limit political content as default and led to concerns of the platform silencing legitimate speech. And in many of these cases, or in response to the downstream effects of these features and various product failures, users have had to adjust the ways they interact on these platforms. And the fear of being silenced has caused a chilling effect and led to creative circumvention techniques, such as replacing letters in the word Palestine with numbers or using a watermelon emoji instead of the Palestinian flag. But the question still remains, should users be adapting their behaviors on these platforms, or should platforms be responsible in employing measures and making adjustments to respond to these issues and concerns? In other geopolitical conflicts, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, major tech platforms have taken actions to demote state-controlled media and offer community resources to Ukrainians affected. Similar measures were not extended to Palestinians, which further demonstrates an imbalance when crises affect different marginalized groups, just as Natalia had mentioned earlier. And in many of these cases, there's speculation as to why technology behaves in a certain way, why most mistakes are waved off as technical glitches, and how to challenge these opaque processes. There's a significant gap in knowledge and discourse on how products and features inadvertently contribute to suppressing content, and the overall lack of accountability in reevaluating and rectifying harmful features. My experiences at Meta in 2021 during the Sheikh Jarrah crisis and being at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society today has allowed me to be in different rooms to see how these issues are discussed. And if we don't work together to address the disconnect in naming the root causes, we won't make progress in developing tangible ways to address them. Some recommendations to big tech companies to ensure proper audits and red teaming of integrity systems and product features before release. On the academic and research side, most of what is shared is theoretical, and it's important that recommendations are translatable and understandable by professionals. And both tech companies and researchers can focus on finding common language and more nuanced terms to describe the phenomena and these mistakes that happen so that harms that are experienced on these platforms can be properly addressed. Terms such as censorship, shadow banning, terror are overloaded and sometimes conflated, which can mask legitimate platform failures. And by not describing these incidences accurately, we lose out on opportunities to reform the underlying problematic systems. And so to conclude and to contextualize these discussions with recent events, we're at a turning point within the tech industry. Alongside layoffs and intense geopolitical events, there's been a reckoning among tech workers. A few weeks ago, 28 Google employees were arrested after protesting the company's position in providing the Israeli government with cloud support. Many tech workers are taking moral and ethical stances and questioning their company's complicity in the atrocities being committed in the region. The premise that some companies err on the side of neutrality is impossible, given that these platforms are undeniably tools that are manipulated and implicitly or inadvertently function to oppress and suppress the voices of marginalized groups. And so we all have a shared responsibility as researchers, academics, and industry professionals to rebuild these platforms and address the embedded bias in these systems to ensure content reach is no longer disproportionately affecting those that are most victimized or oppressed. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mara. Thank you for pointing out the responsibility of policymakers as well in dealing with big tech companies. Okay, it's obviously a fascinating topic that we will discuss during the Q&A session. And you raised also the question of the issue of big tech company and increasing polarization instead of perhaps being peacekeepers. What is what would be the policymakers and government will do about it, especially when we have to face other issues such as countering violent extremism. But one of the things Anne Bellon that you're looking at, especially using the Iraqi field. So I'm sure that your lead is fascinating as well, and I'm very eager to listen to this. As everyone is here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for the opportunity to present a research that is still a work in progress due to a very difficult and challenging fieldwork, as you will see. And also because I started my research in content moderation very far away from Iraq. Actually, I was just studying international forums where this question was discussed and new principles and norms were invented and developed. And one day I was interested to notice an Iraqi delegation that was actually touring Europe in order to discuss and discover the different ways that Western countries such as Germany or France at the time were trying to address this issue of content moderation and the fight against violent extremism. And I became very interested in this group, and they invited me to be part of their reflection in Iraq. And it was also a very interesting time because we had a massive extension of ISIS over Syria and Iraq. So you also had a lot of attention on these countries where social media was used as a vector of terrorist propaganda. So my main question was not so much the question of Iraq, but also how principles and modes of intervention could circulate from transnational arenas to local arenas. And how does this fight against violent extremism adapt or ill-adapt to specific local contexts? So my approach is really an approach of political sociology, where I'm interested in various regulatory assemblages. That is to say, I focus on the variety of actors and their power relations and how they shape norms and regulatory practices. So even if principle could seem the same in the distance, they could be embedded in very different practices. And also I'm interested in the interpolation of legal, technical, and social infrastructure that are quite specific, as you would see in Iraq. And also I was interested in this double narrative that you had between the idea that you had a lot of policy transfer in this issue of content moderation, where principles could circulate from one country or another, or some people would even talk about convergence of content moderation or content moderation and CB as a global transnational issue. And at the same time, you had strong hypotheses about the territorialization or the fragmentation of the internet with, in fact, very specific principles and practices that are developing in different countries. So I was interested in answering this question. What is it in the end, like convergence or fragmentation? So my field work was mainly to follow these Iraq's representatives first when they were touring Europe and Germany and Brussels. And also at the time I met trusted flaggers from Iraq that self-trained in international progress. And then I followed them back in Iraq where they would discuss and try to implement all those principles. So basically it amounts to 13 days of observation. I also got access to a lot of confidential reports from different, mainly UN organizations on ISIS propaganda. And I did 18 interviews. There were in-person interviews with NGOs, UN agency members, and only 2 government representatives. I could explain a little bit about the challenges of doing fieldworks there in the Q&A. So mainly I would just briefly present the Iraqi context, that is quite specific, of course, and then move to the local challenges of fighting violent extremism online, and what I mean by security from a distance, sorry. So about the Iraqi context, and as Mariëlle was saying, it's very dynamic, so it's constantly changing. Even something that I have been observing could not be so true right now because it's constantly changing. But you had like 2 main events, so the US withdrawal in 2011, and then the defeat of ISIS in 2017. That prompted a move from what we call emergency programs to development programs. Basically, those are 2 categories of UN intervention, and it's not exactly the same organization that intervene in emergency context and development context. And so what was left is that now you have Iraq that is under the influence of pro-Iranian Shia militias. So some part of the country are not even really under the control of the state. You also have what is very interesting is a huge social protest against corruption, sectarianism in October 2018 that led to the organization of new elections. And this electoral process was also marked by a lot of violence and by the emergence of a Shia movement that is anti-Iranian, so a nationalist movement that is a Sadrist movement that has also been responsible for a lot of violence online. And then on top of that, sorry, it's a very gloomy beginning of presentation, but you also have a lot of new climate led tensions in Iraq because some farmers in the south of the east part of the countries have to move, and it creates a lot of ethnic tensions, especially targeting, for example, the Yazidi community that is a Kurdish minority. And with this also changing context from emergency to development programs, you also have a change of actors that are present on the Iraq soil, and with a lot of new private companies that are trying to find a role and a position, especially Chinese companies, for example, to replace UN agencies that were acting as a supplementary administration for the Iraqi state. In terms of social media development in Iraq, so it's very difficult to find reliable data on this. So pretty sure we know that the internet penetration is of concerns like quarters of the population. And we know that social media use concerns a little bit more than half of the population. You have to know that also using social media is forbidden for any underage individual. So it means that these numbers also reflect this in these small numbers. And although YouTube and Facebook and Instagram also are highly used, for example, Twitter is not that used. It's rather used by a small minority, especially established in Baghdad. But even those numbers are, they should be subject to a lot of question. And what was interesting is, for example, when we try to find the numbers from social media, from Facebook, they announced that the advertisement market is shrinking. something that you could interpret as a lower number of social media users, but that is quite different for the case of Iraq, because at the same time, you have an increase. Other reports show an increase of social media use, but it means that the value, in fact, associated to each users and to the potentiality of making money out of these users is diminishing in Iraq. And it's quite interesting to find this different account of how the market, the Iraqi market is expanding or not. Yeah, so I would also like to mention, because you see it's a very specific issue in Iraq, that we also have a gendered use of social media. It's more rare for women to have a social media account because it's quite dangerous. And when they do, they often never publish photos of themselves that could be submitted to manipulation and AI change, which could lead to horror crime, which is something I will also talk a little bit about. So in fact, in Iraq, which is quite different maybe from the Western countries that we've discussed earlier on, you have scattered players, and all of them have very fragile legitimacies in terms of intervention on social media. So at the center, you have, of course, the Iraqi government, but it is a weak state. You have three actors that were present on all my fieldworks, mostly the National Security Office, the ONSA, the Ministry of Interior, and you also have, and it's quite important, a new commission that was created at the very beginning of ISIS, but that has gained a lot of power recently. That is the Communication Media Commission, and which is playing an increasing role in implementing new regulations in terms of content moderation. You also have a strong role played by UN agencies, because at the time that I was surveying Iraq, they were also playing the role of a supplementary administration to the Iraqi state. And so they were present in almost every discussion about content moderation regulation, and also they are financing a lot of reports and research on these questions in Iraq. Then you also have tech companies. They are quite distant. Their cooperation with the government is actually quite limited because there are no direct contact between the Iraqi government and these companies. The closest links that I have been able to witness is a formal cooperation with Huawei in Iraq on the question of content moderation, which opens a lot of questions, but I have to move faster. And around these three major actors, you have a myriad of small organizations that are the ones that are doing, in fact, content moderation. And they receive support and ephemeral support from the tech companies and UN agencies. And the most important ones, and maybe the one that we will talk the most about, is Tech for Peace. That is an Iraqi-based organization that is the only official trusted flagger that Facebook has in Iraq. So what are the local challenges of this global issue? So as I told you, there has been a direct influence of Western legislations on the framing of the Online Safety Act in Iran. So they directly refer to the NetzDG, to the French laws. They have even copied and translated part of these laws in order to draft their first bill. And the idea, so witnessing the examples of France and Germany, was to reinforce what was already existing, the Commission on Social Media, like the Communication and Media Commission that I talked earlier on, to act as the main regulatory authority in Iraq, although of course it does not enjoy the same independence that regulatory have in this type of countries. And also they have used the language of the NetzDG and the French laws, raising a lot of issues. So I have attended like several meetings with judicial experts, government experts that were really fighting over the definition of violent extremism, for example. And of course, even if there is like a false consensus in international fora around this idea, in Iraq, in the local context, it really raised like concrete disputes and controversies in those arenas where people were really battling over one word that should or should not be included. And why that? Well, for so many reasons, because if you take like a common definition of terrorism or violent extremism, that is to say any forms of online violence of content that could threaten the security of a country, a lot of things could enter in this definition. So they tried to add like a lot of specification, but with each specification, there was the fear of targeting a specific group. So in the end, this is still like the main difficulty in the drafting of the law is to define those terms. There's also an important phenomenon program in Iraq that is called social cohesion, is that in fact a lot of people in villages have been relaying some ISIS propaganda, because basically ISIS was on their villages and they did not really have the choice, and they feel that we could criminalize too much having a link whatsoever with one terrorist organization when people are not considered completely free in what they adhere or do not adhere online. And there is also the definition of proportionate sanction that has raised like a lot of issue, because when you criminalize something in Iraq, you could face like death threats or something worse. So it was really interesting to witness those discussions. The second thing, and I'm going to move like quite rapidly on that because you talked about that already, but it's the limits of automation. And of course, we tend in the West to rely increasingly on AI, and I was very interested in this hash database that was offered by the GIF-CT, but it does not really work in this context. And for example, for a long time, ISIS-related content was moderated thanks to dictionaries that were developed by local and grassroots organizations that transmitted them to so database of words, of expressions, and of images transmitted to the platforms. But we are talking about a country where you have 4 languages that could be used by the population and many dialects that are also currently used. And you have also, they have witnessed a lot of strategies developed not only by ISIS, but also by pro-militia groups in order to enable automated moderation using orthographic mistakes, crop videos, emojis, punctuation, like a lot of things that I've developed. And I have even accessed like documents from the ISIS where you have like PDFs where they explain how to avoid basic content removal from on Facebook and YouTube. And also you have a lot of alternative news outlets and spamming strategies used by online armies. So they don't even, sometimes they act by the force of numbers. And so you could send like a lot of people harassing an activist online. And even if you have a reaction, it's very often too late and the damage has been done. And what grassroots organizations are also trying to do is to reframe the context of countering violent extremism, because they say terrorists is not our main issue. And we are facing like so many difficulties day to day in Iraq. So for example, during the election, you had a lot of buying and selling of voters' cards. So here you have an example of a video that shows, an exchange between dollars and new voter cards in order to affect the electoral processes. You also have a lot of intimidation campaign of women and LGBTQ activists. So just 5 days ago, actually, an activist was shot in front of her house after having received like a lot of hate comments on TikTok. You have rumors targeting ethnic groups, like it reappears like from time to time that Yazidi, for example, they eat the skulls of children, that they are doing very bad things. And it's related actually to local conflicts about access to water due to climate change constraints. And you also have hacking for money. And basically grassroots organizations are trying to shift the attention from CVE to something that is more adapted to what they are struggling day to day in terms of online violence. So what do I mean by security from a distance? First, that tech companies are actually very distant from the day-to-day challenges of content moderation in Iraq. There are no experts and no office in countries like Iraq. The only office that Meta has, for example, in the region is in Dubai, a country that is quite different, even in terms of the Arabic language that is used and in terms of the references and so on. Also, that tech companies are tending to rely increasingly on algorithms and AI, and those technologies are often developed abroad and they are never audited in the fields, creating ill-adapted specificity to the Iraqi context. And what is also very interesting is that there are little to no implication in local debates. So, here, for example, I have compared like the amount of government requests received by Meta in Iraq and in France. And you see that, for example, in Iraq, you have like less than 20 government requests received by Meta, and that most of them were not answered by Meta. Whereas in France, you have a cooperation with the big tech that has developed, and that is now achieving something that we could dub like co-regulation, and we could discuss the implication of that, but it does not exist in such countries. Same thing for the content removed from Meta and in Iraq and in France. And this security from a distance contrasts with violence experimented by local and grassroots actors that are basically facing dangers in their day-to-day life, because when you fact-checking in Iraq, you have to go in the village where this crime happened and you have to check what has really happened. There is so a huge turnover among the journalists that participate in this fact-checking activity, and most of them are also under government surveillance. And there have been reports that shows that Pegasus was also used by the Iraqi government. And at the same time, because CV is a real problem in Iraq, you have this strong push from the government to adopt a cyber law that is in fact extremely restrictive in terms of human rights and liberties. So activists find themselves like kind of in between those two tensions. And at the same time, you have, so basically the whole content moderation tends to rely on those intermediary organizations that, if they succeed, became trusted flaggers for tech companies and experts for governmental bodies. But most of them are established abroad for security reasons. They receive financing and trading from international fora. So they contribute to the circulation of principles and norms, but also sometimes to this misadjustment between principles and the local context. And the other thing is that, as you know, the tech companies have witnessed some difficulties, and the translation was a lot of layoffs in the US, but also they have stopped financing a lot of programs in Iraq. And those were the programs that documented the specificities of violence, that were filling the database for dictionary and images to fight online crime. So, in terms of concluding remarks, so we witnessed something that I should say like a reverse of mixed Brussels effects, because yes, we can see the importation of Western principles in the context of this region, but this is reinterpreted under the prism of local media and political landscape that is completely different in this country. You also see, and that is, I think the main idea is that content moderation is really a commodity for big tech. And in Iraq, because it's not associated with growing advertisement markets, it is a cheap commodity, so that we would not invest a lot even in ensuring a trustworthy online space. And you also have, with this example, the very strong limits of technical solutions in fighting violent extremism. So we're talking about this new AI and so on, but we show that they often fail in very specific contexts where you have to play with different languages and you have like a lot of plasticity of what you can publish online. So yeah, maybe I stop. This is just like further developments, but I've already been too long. Thank you very much for your attention.
So much we are to read before the marvelous to share and moderate today. Valentine, I'm sure that you're going to take your lead on showing how the title to the several of Counsel about science and the role of big data platform. I would love to video with that. Thanks very much.
So hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and thank you to the organizer for this conference. Today I am going to present our work with Benoît, who is unfortunately not here today, but yes, I will present our work on the issue of algorithmic content moderation and terrorist content. Okay, thank you. So, in the face of violent extremist speech on digital platforms, algorithms have increasingly been promoted as the most effective approach to perform essential moderation functions. But algorithms are not alone. The literature on content moderation shows the role of algorithmic and human intervention and the changing nature of power relations between government, internet companies, and civil society. At the same time, research on critical security studies have also analyzed how algorithms produce security. So this presentation explores the interweaving faculties of algorithmic content moderation and human operator and the implications of this human algorithmic cognitive assemblage for the surveillance of terrorist speech. So the idea here is to contribute to the current debate on algorithmic regulation and content moderation about terrorist speech by engaging with the literature on critical securities and post-human studies. In particular, this presentation adopts the notion of cognitive assemblage developed by Catherine Hales. So, how algorithmic content moderation works? Algorithms are increasingly capable of analyzing different types of data, image, text, video, audio, etc., making it possible to ensure a wider coercive dimension in the moderation of content. Currently, large platforms mainly use two types of automated tools in their content moderation. The first is image matching algorithms, which compare new posts to existing content base. So to remove content, platforms use the so-called hash technology. So if a user uploads a new terrorist video or image, the system checks whether the image matches a no terrorist photo or video. Secondly,
platforms have invested in content detection and classification technologies using machine learning algorithms. So these algorithms learn to detect terrorist publication from previously deleted Al-Qaeda and Islamic State terrorist propaganda text. So here, the instruction will no longer be explicitly programmed by an engineer. In this case, algorithms adductively generate traits and targets via pattern recognition in large volumes of data. Consequently, machine learning algorithms involve that the security objective isn't clearly articulated or pre-specified. Rather than collecting evidence, this algorithmic form of governmentability reinforces preemption in the management of informational flux. So while algorithms are typically thought of as a powerful and autonomous force by digital platforms, they still need humans to operate. What we can see is that while technology companies advertise the deployment of powerful detection algorithms, they also deployed a powerful detection of algorithms. They have significantly increased the size of their security and safety team and moderator. Moreover, while algorithms do most reporting, companies also seek to enlist their user communities in this process. Furthermore, to improve their moderation tools' effectiveness and expand their expertise, platforms have intensified partnership with other technology companies, governments, civil society groups, academics, and NGOs. The objective is to foster shared learning about terrorism and propaganda mechanisms related to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. So why do algorithms need humans? Human expertise remains essential in two types of areas. First, algorithms can only be assembled into stable structure through design and training sequences that depend on humans. As we have just seen with the increase in the number of safety team employees, automation hasn't so much replaced humans, has multiplied the need for their intervention. And second, algorithms can be poor regulator in more complex contexts. So first, the algorithms perform poorly in understanding the context of speech. For instance, a photo of an armed man waving an ISIS flag may be propaganda or recruiting material, but could be an image in a news story. And to understand more nuanced cases, algorithms need human expertise. Another challenge for platforms are to develop an integrative technology that works across different media types. For example, an algorithmic solution that works for photo will not necessarily be useful for video or text. Moreover, the usefulness of machine learning algorithms remain limited in particular contexts. Companies explain that a system designed to search content from one terrorist group doesn't work on other terrorist groups due to the difference in language and propaganda style, as you mentioned just before. But for example, why Facebook offers its interface in 111 languages, its algorithm can only detect hate speech in 30 languages and terrorist propaganda in 19 languages. Finally,
detection algorithms has also problem with live content. For instance, Facebook Live was activated during the Christchurch shooting. Viewed by 4,000 people, it took 29 minutes for the video to get its first flag and be removed. So the algorithm was blindsided as it was confronted with data it had never been trained on, even though the company has developed technology that can spot certain teams or image in live video and block them immediately, at last in theory. But it gives us an important information. The intervention of automated systems are only effective if the present looks like the past. So non-conscious form of automated cognition require that new terrorist materials be similar and analogous to old terrorist materials. So the security of laws emerge from continuous and complex interactivity between technical, social, and personal multiplicities. Our emphasis in the plural dynamics of algorithmic regulation offers an alternative narrative to the more dramatic interpretation where powerful algorithms shape our life. This is not to minimize the manipulative nature of this technology, but to recognize that they truck a cognitive assemblage oriented toward rationalities of threat anticipation, and that they are not in themselves the primary locus of control. Humans play an essential role in this process. Thus, the solution to manage extensive informational flows is never binary, but hybrid, fluid, and cobbled together. The rise of this cognitive assemblage for the proactive management of harmful content has 4 major implications that must be explored further. First, this assemblage illustrates an emerging modality of control that goes beyond liberal individualism and technical rationality. What is central is the collective and distributed process. Second, it illustrates how the hybridity of new risk management practices change the temporal scale of monitoring and regulatory techniques. Third, despite the shifting nature of their boundary, the risk model underlying this assemblage are based on actuarial framework, favoring knowledge about digital trace above knowledge about people. We have therefore a search for correlation rather than a search for causality. And as a result, they provide an intelligence knowledge that rests on statistical techniques guided by prediction and action, and no longer by understanding. And finally, this hybrid form of governance has normative implication, questioning how transparency and oversight mechanisms should be calibrated in the case of this assemblage. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Valentine, and to all of our wonderful panelists. This has been a wonderful deep dive into the issues with platform regulations at the most macro level, and then at the tiniest level of individual pieces of content as well. I know we are already late, but I'm sure everyone will be okay if we still do like 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A, if that's fine. And I'm sure you all have questions, so feel free to ask. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you very much for the presentations. I will have some questions for Anne Bellon about the case on Iraq. So it was very interesting the case to me, and I wanted to ask you a question about if you see differences between the platforms operating in Iraq and the way they moderate content. Some platforms performing better than others. For instance, TikTok is there, you mentioned TikTok. Does TikTok have a more localized outlook on moderating platforms? Because Chinese companies tend to say that they have another way of operating and they try to tailor their strategy according to every context, particularly the case in Iraq. And you just mentioned that Huawei has some kind of an agreement with the UI government on content configuration. If you could elaborate on that.
Thank you very much for the question. In terms of differences, it's difficult to evaluate which one is doing better, especially because they are dealing with quite different content. YouTube with more videos and Facebook and Instagram with more photos and accounts. What we've seen in terms of corporations, that organizations tend to have cooperated a little bit more with Facebook, with Meta, which could also be explained by the fact that in the wake of ISIS expansion in Iraq, Meta has invested a lot in several organizations and research programs tackling these issues. And beyond TikTok, so TikTok expansion is quite recent. In Iraq, it has been used by a lot of activists, and it's not very good. For example, the social media influencer that was killed very recently, she was TikTok star, and she was the subject of a lot of hate campaign on TikTok against which nothing had been done, and which was probably also facilitated by the government who had tried her a few months before. And in terms of cooperation between Huawei and the Commission on Media and Communication, it's difficult to know exactly the content of this cooperation. Officially, it's a cooperation on cybersecurity. So dealing more with deeper layers of internet applications rather than social media. But it's also interesting that Huawei has a lot of programs of cooperation with the IRT government, for example, helping them to develop government as a platform, or helping them with the digital transition of the state. So there are many great variety of cooperation programs between Huawei and the government at the moment.
Gulnara.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. I have a question for Mariëlle. I was very impressed by the presentation because I'm studying kind of the other side, you can say, of this phenomenon. I'm studying the publics of Russian media in Europe, and I know that even though it is done here, people are still getting access to it through VPNs or other techniques. And at the same time, I am originally from Russia, and I know that people my age in Russia still use Instagram, still use this social media that are banned, and there is some influencers and more artists or more public figures. So I was curious, what do you think about the efficiency of these bans and how, for example, using VPNs will impact monetization?
Yes, thank you very much. I think what you just mentioned, it emphasizes that when you look at Russian internet censorship, it is very contradictory. So indeed, we see that on the one hand, platforms are banned, at the same time, government officials still use them. And also if you take, for example, I would just say the Twitter account of Dmitry Medvedev. So he's tweeting on a platform that is banned in Russia, and he's tweeting content that is not permissible according to the policies of the platform, but he's allowed to stay on there because he's a politician. So there we see how for both sides, and both for the platform side and from the country side, it actually doesn't make sense, but still it happens. So I think we need to be really careful about these kinds of examples where indeed it doesn't appear to be logical, but at the same time it actually is happening. But what you ask about indeed about the monetization and what the prospect of this is, then I do expect that there will be further crackdowns in the sense that we see that Russia is now also starting to block VPNs also based on the actual protocol. So we see an expansion of more and more VPN services actually being blocked. So of course, within like the internet freedom community, the technical people always say, well, we can find a way around it. Yes, but most people cannot. So I think that this is really how we should view it. That yes, on the one hand, it's not complete. At the same time, the number of people that actually move with that and are able to circumvent these restrictions, with every step, it becomes smaller. So it's a smaller and smaller community. So indeed, we see a lot of gray areas, both for Russians outside of Russia still trying to have these conversations across the border, which are actually very active, that I'm also very surprised about. And people from Russia still being very active on these Western platforms. I follow a lot of people on Facebook that are still very active. But it's what I think is the most depressing part, perhaps, is that we do see more and more prosecutions for what people have said on Western social media and also what they have said in the past. Because in Russia, laws apply retroactively or are applied retroactively. So this means that it might be okay for now, but actually there might be very severe consequences, where these consequences are also for indeed, right now, if you share a rainbow emoji, you might be prosecuted for promoting a banned extremist organization, which doesn't. So I think that this is what makes it very complicated. On the one hand, we have the actual reality of the laws and the platforms and so on. And then you have the enforcement and the actual effects. And it's not always predictable, but at the same time, it is moving in a very clear direction, which is increased censorship and impact. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing our discussion later on. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the information. I actually get as a sort of like practitioner, I get asked a lot by journalists, comments, trying to which platform will get blocked or YouTube get blocked. So I often actually rely on the similar indicators that you presented on. So I'm happy that in touch with those theoretical understanding. But I wanted to ask because so the blocking of Meta and specifically Facebook and Instagram was kind of shocking. It didn't really conform to our predictions because of some of those things that you mentioned, that it's really popular. A lot of people rely on them for their income, also like regular people like using them, like the families. But I think the boost invasion of Ukraine and the two things, one is Meta's policy that you mentioned, allowing for false use of false word using violence against politicians and military, and then the Western sanctions, which I think those two things kind of, because they allow the private way, allow the government to just look inside us instead who don't want us, it's us who are allowing good speech, and so somehow this political it makes political less visible. So I wonder if you kind of look at those also sort of wild cards, I guess you have all of these factors, but then sometimes this crazy thing happens and then all bets are off, like how do you think this events?
Yeah, I'm totally comparing that the question I got asked most is, so when are they going to block music? And they're like, well, I don't know. We don't know, but what I think, Elisa fully agree that this was a very particular moment when we saw indeed increased censorship and so on, but at the same time, there was also always the assumption that they would not block or not yet. And having this tool still block, of course, first of all, was because they were then capable of doing it, whereas a few years earlier, it's not really the case, so that's also maybe the viable option. But what I think we actually need to look most at is just the changes of the nature of the regime. So I've actually also myself done research on how they try to legitimize internet censorship. So this is all TV campaign around justifying the ban of Telegram in 2018. So then they still had this urge to try and explain and gain and that promote the cycle of support for these kinds of measures. But of course, by now we're dealing with a very, very outspoken authoritarian regime where these kinds of things no longer matter, and where any form of resistance is met with further violent repression. So that also means that this kind of interaction with society and trying to gain some kind of popular support, it doesn't really matter anymore because of the nature of the regime. So for me, the fact that they did block, it basically means that the situation is really, really dire, that it no longer matters, even if it's not complete, even if it's still circumvented themselves. Just the fact that they did that means that popular opinion no longer matters, and what kind of impact it has on your economic viability, what kind of local impact it has, it no longer matters. So that's the way that I view it. But at the same time, we see that the case of the other platforms, that it's really, really difficult to predict because it's just so complicated. And because it's not just the government itself, it's also the ministry in charge of digital affairs. It's also the domestic Russian tech companies. There's actually this interplay of all these different actors that makes these decisions so very, very difficult to predict that. But the only thing we know for certain is that it's going in the wrong direction. Cool.
Yes, Emily.
I have a question for so what strikes me in innovation is that a lot of language content is not very good at all. Particularly in relation to the source of the comments that it seems that there is a systematic bias against the kind of content that makes it particularly difficult to disentangle the comments supporting those. In your experience, also working in Facebook, in case there is no NDA, how far do you see the efforts that platforms will need to take to be able to discern the difference between those two things? So, normal subject content and the violence.
I think the issue is twofold. One with the fact that a lot of the classifiers are very developing and they want to different dialects of Arabic, which requires to speak a different Arabic to very, very different Arabic or other Arabic that's spoken in other countries. And so the fact that the systems aren't developed in that sense, doesn't pick up on that nuance, and it leads to a lot of false positives. So probably significant that's taken down where it actually is behind. And then also from the videos or the review that they did in 2021, they found that there was also a lack of training and content moderators that may be working in a specific region where they have that expertise in those certain values, but more properly trained to be able to respond actively to others. That's an area that was in a different dialect. And so I think both are needed in terms of being able to address a lot of the mistakes that are happening when there's a crisis and they're bringing on more moderators to kind of really talk and content that's going to be used on the platform to be able to properly handle without either the false positive or not catching the mistake.
Yes, Gavin.
Yeah, that's better.
All right.
Thanks very much. It was great. learned a lot. Just quickly, because I know about we're at the end of the day, and this is a fantastic study, and I really want to hear more about this. Can you say a little bit more about the role of the UN as an actor in the CBU sector that you described? And when you're talking about localized grievances around the conflict with CBE, is some of that directed towards the UN agencies that we talked about? The thing that's in the back of my mind there, of course, is the massive shift that's happened in the Security Council around pushing the localized CBE agenda. I'm not describing thinking, but a lot of that work is happening through the UN counterterrorism executive director. It's happening in IRSEM and the UNP in places like that. So is this a story of globalized Security Council norms hitting localized resistance around what should an agency like the UN be doing in a place like the world? Is that part of the story? So that's a really fascinating story, and I want to really hear more about that. Now that you ended with platforms need to do more auditing, more effective auditing, academics to make their research more translatable. I mean, the risks of both of those, there are risks of both of those. From where I'm situated, a lot of the counterterrorism research for platform is so thoroughly instrumentalized that it fails to ask some of the more serious questions. And that's precisely on the right understand a lot of the plot. I just want quick answers to the problem. So what are the risks of how do we do effective research that doesn't just provide instrumental responses to the problems there? And on the question of auditing, from your perspective of working inside the platforms, of course, if we leave auditing to the platforms themselves, then it may just be business as usual. So when you're proposing a more transparent form of external oversight in the auditing platforms, is that really distinct from the platforms that you take it, or are you suggesting we just need to have platforms self-audit themselves? What data do we have for the platforms are going to produce more effective results? It's really process. And Valentine, if I can ask one question quickly, and that is, I love the paper and I love the presentation. Can you say more about the cognitive dimension of the assemblage that you're describing as well? Because the assemblage that you describe is very socio-technical, very material, and I want to hear more about what particular aspect is epistemic or cognitive that you take from chaos. And you ended with this idea of what we're seeing as a new form of risk management. How does the kind of risk management that you're describing in the paper, does it depart from the type of risk management that we've seen preemptive security after 9/11 for the last? What's distinctive about the risk management approach that you're describing in the Thanks. Very good.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question. I was actually, amazed with why would the IRM or the university get interested in this question? And what I understood from the fieldwork is also that UN agencies is actually a very complex system. And those agencies, they are backing for resources and attention from the UN Council and the UN organization in the US. And so they are building and becoming a small constituency where they are trying to deal with a lot of things in order to have access to crucial resources and to crucial actors. And for me, this is the main impulse behind this fact that several agencies are back to dealing with CBE. And the other thing that you mentioned that is also very true is how much we are part of this globalization of CBE. And what is even more true for UN is that if you work in UN Iraq, for example, you cannot be from Iraq. They are trying to have a balanced team representing a lot of countries to avoid all kind of influence and corruptions. So there are also were a lot of people from Egypt, from Jordania, and Emirates
that were bringing up their own conception of CV into the programs that they were financing and what they would discuss with the government. So it's also like very interesting to see how these institutions are part of what is constructed as a specific definition of CV that is not so much adjusted to the reality faced by the rest of the organizations.
I think that's your last question about self-bonding and very really know that is going to appreciate the help these companies. But after thinking a little bit about, I think a lot of what pushed Meta invested to build more privacy change, the privacy info because of the fear fines, and they had a lot of compliance and things that they needed to address. And so if there are repercussions to these mistakes, then that would be more of an incentive and number for them to actually investigate fixing that. One mistake that I did mention that had happened recently related to some of the AI systems that were functioning and just weren't working properly was with WhatsApp stickers. The fact that we recently launched AI stickers when you search for terms, it'll come up with some results. What happened was if you search for Palestinian, it would show little Palestinian kids or kids holding guns. If you typed in Israeli, nothing of that sort showed up. And so this was actually in production for a few weeks. Employees escalated internally. They told the team, they kept saying, "Oh, it's a one-off," and it wasn't until it got media attention that they actually fixed it. And that was because of that public pressure. And so I feel like public pressure is always some incentive or some lever for them to actually action on things, but there's also additional fines or additional reasons for them to investigate something before it's actually production.
Thank you for your interesting question. There are several points about this. I think that really the specificity of this cognitive assemblage is how they operate about the scale and monitoring about regulatory techniques, because we have algorithms who are there very quickly, and we have content who are very quickly diffused. So I think the question of scale and speed about diffusion and regulation are very specific about this type of cognitive assemblage. And I think that I don't know if it's specificity, it's a good word, but what I been interesting, it's that when we talk about algorithm or AI or algorithm AI, we just only think this question just into side of it's just a primary locus of control, and there are a sort of invisibilization of all the humans and the role of humans in this regulatory type of algorithmic content moderation, etc. So I think that it's very interesting that reflect algorithm content moderation of terrorist speech on the side of this hybridity of technique and human who are trying to regulate a risk that they are similar of after 11, as you ask or discuss. I think we are in the same thing of preemptivity of risk as we see with the 11 terrorist attack. But the difference here is that we have a new actor, which are big tech, because before the several terrorist attacks that they were in US, Europe, etc., the approach of platform about content or terrorist content was not the same. At the beginning, for instance, of YouTube, Al-Qaeda, for instance, could distribute their propaganda if it was not violent or, there are some graphic violence. But because we were in free speech, etc., And, you know, there is like a laissez-faire approach about content. But with Charlie Hebdo, etc., it changed radically and with ISIS, etc., where platform, we are not just in laissez-faire approach, but they are really, how to say that, a security turn where platform have to take responsibility to make the space safety and yes, safety. So I think it's about the preemptivity. We are in the same thing, but with new actors, which are big tech.
Thank you, everyone, for this great discussion. I think it's formally a wrap on day one of the conference.